for joining us today as we dive into part two of our series. Want to get us started in typical Eduphoria fashion with a quick icebreaker. I have a seasonal question for us here since we're so close to the day. Halloween is on Friday this year. That means no sugar high students the next morning. How does this make you feel as an educator? Drop your answer into the chat, A, B, C, or D. Is it A, do you feel like this is the best gift of 2025 so far for educators? Do you feel like B, I might actually hand out full-size candy bars this year since I don't have the ramifications? C, I'm still recovering from last year's Halloween being on Thursday. And then D, I'm just really glad the custodial staff gets an easier Friday night. My apologies if you heard my dogs there for a second. Awesome. Looking at some of the answers rolling in, we have quite a few A's. Best gift of 2025 so far. Some people throwing some D's out there for the custodial staff. Uh, Caroline or Carolyn, she did A and D. Yeah, Fridays are the best for Halloween. I'm typically okay with Saturdays too. Awesome. Thank you all for participating and dropping those thoughts in there. In general, I'm just stoked it's Friday. We're having really big plans this year compared to other years because of it. All right, let's move on along. Before we dive in, I actually want to give a shout out and thank you to Taylor McCoy. She's Eduphoria's marketing content specialist. We've got a little info about her here. She served as the creative writing teacher and literacy tutor for primary school students before transitioning to her own classroom as a 10th grade English teacher. And after 4 years in education, she now creates comprehensive resources for educators. Um, the bulk of the content from the part one and part two of this webinar series actually came from her ebook titled Data 101 for New and Developing Administrators. So when you get a copy of this presentation over sometime in the next couple of days, take a look at that link and you can go to the Eduphoria's website via that URL in the slide deck, or just go to eduphoria.com, go to resources, you can actually find it, click it, and you can download that resource and share it with your people in your district. She's just such a wizard with all things social media and has been putting out content for most of the major social media platforms for Eduphoria for a little over a year now. And if you aren't following us already, be sure to look us up, give us a follow, and check out her work. She actually recently put out a little summary video that's about a minute or so long that recaps important pieces from part one of this series. And so go take a look at that. Take a look at Facebook and um, uh, oh gosh, my brain just went blank. LinkedIn, etc. And take a look at Eduphoria. Okay, so let's recap and reset the stage real quick. This is part two of a four-part series. So if you missed part one, I'm going to do a brief recap here in a moment, but please check out our YouTube channel to actually watch the entire part one's recording. This entire webinar series will equip you with the tools and mindset to take the first or next steps into effective data analysis. So whether you're new to this work or looking to sharpen your approach, you'll leave with clear strategies to make data more meaningful and more actionable in your specific role, whether you're at the district level or the campus level. The different parts of this, last 2 months ago, part one, we actually looked at building and executing a data philosophy. So we were setting the foundation that you were going to build the house of data and data analysis upon. Today, part two, we're going to be looking at identifying data practices for your school or your district. And then parts three and four coming in the spring, we're going to actually look at the Eduphoria platform and look at leveraging data visuals in Eduphoria to do the things we're talking about in part one and part two. So in part one, we set up why this entire series was important. So let's go over that real fast. This is important because data processes help us understand what's happening in our schools and in our district, of course, depending on which role or position that you have. When we understand the data, we can lead with clarity, confidence, and purpose, making informed decisions about instruction, staff, students, support, intervention, enrichment, resource allocation, you name it. Data is where you need to be living in at least part of the time in order to make the best decisions you possibly can. So here's why it matters. It leads to smarter decisions. Data actually highlights what's working and what isn't. It's allowing us to focus efforts where they're going to have the greatest impact or, quote, the best bang for your buck. It helps us use time and resources wisely. Analyzing how data is collected and used can reveal inefficiencies and help streamline our systems. And notice I talked about both pieces, how we're actually collecting the data and using the data. Both can be areas of improvement or areas of efficiency that you can stack upon. It uncovers what students and teachers need most in an efficient way. By looking deeper into performance and demographic data, we can ensure that our strategies are equitable and targeted where we need that effort. It helps build trust and momentum. When small wins are backed by data, we build credibility and support for bigger initiatives. And then finally, it strengthens teaching and learning, which is really what we're about. That last one is the most critical of all of these. By aligning leadership decisions with the same data that teachers rely on, we can create shared language for growth and improvement. So let's take a quick look at part one, crafting your data philosophy. Understanding the foundations of a data philosophy, we start with a data philosophy, what it is. It acts as the foundation for all data-driven work, answering the whys, the hows, and the whats of your data usage. It should align context for staff by defining the purpose of assessments, purchased resources, or initiatives that are going on. The process of building this foundation involves 10 essential steps that I went over in that webinar series. So again, go check that one out so you can see each step. But it began with establishing a goal that will drive action and then creating a dream team of data collection analysis gurus. That team then drafts a list of objectives and beliefs and expectations that make the philosophy tangible. Like what data to pull, how often we need to pull it, and then guiding questions for analysis, like how are we actually looking at this? How are we thinking about this? And then ultimately, a strong foundation is necessary because of all of that hard work at first. It's sometimes difficult to get it started, but once it's done, all of this becomes a time saver in the long run for decision making. Recognizing district to team structure and alignment is a huge part of a data philosophy as well. Data philosophy should exist at different levels at the district, the school, and the team, each with varying context and boundaries. So, for example, the district level should be the least restrictive area in a data philosophy, focusing on the whys and the overall expectations, allowing for school level customization. The school level then follows the district framework, but has that flexibility for their school's personality, their processes, their unique students, and then weighing in on assessment data for professional development creation for their campuses, recognizing that one size does not necessarily fit all. And then finally, at the team level, it involves teams, quote, doing the work. They're establishing the norms that they're going to follow. They're establishing the pace they're going to follow. They're doing the assigned work. This requires a fine-tuned approach that is consistently needing modeling, reinforcement, and being monitored um, throughout the year and throughout the entire cycle of a data cycle. This structure ensures that practices are not optional. And remember this key phrase when you're doing anything related to data and data practices, things that aren't checked and monitored become optional. And then we identify the benefit of data clarity. Creating a clear data philosophy and ensuring data clarity directly leads to several benefits. These include making it easier for staff to do their jobs and reach their goals, and supporting student success through more informed decisions. The long term benefit is saving time by avoiding confusion and inconsistent practices because those are the two biggest time sinks when people don't know what to do and they have no way of knowing which way to execute it. Clarity is achieved through the planning and execution steps, which involve creating a messaging framework, establishing clear procedures that eliminate kinks in the system, and reinforcing procedures with professional learning. The overall message is that an informed philosophy ensures that you're using time and resources wisely and is strengthening teaching and learning through that. And then finally, on our part one recap is initiating purposeful data conversations. Purposeful data conversations are initiated by the active communication and execution of the data philosophy. Once the framework is built, you must send the message and then handle the logistics, such as scheduling meetings so they get attention. This is a critical time to consider culture, not only at the campus level or school level, but also at the district level. Is your staff ready to hear the goal? Are you prepared to take something off of the staff members' plates so that you have room for this new initiative or this new goal? Finally, conversations and practice are sustained by monitoring your data philosophy through progress checks, documentation, feedback loops. We even spent time talking about doing walkthroughs on your PLCs because that's one of the best ways to get domain one on the T-test evaluation rubric, domain one evidence, but it also helps you monitor these processes and ensure that team process addresses student strengths and needs and helps identify students for remediation, thereby living your data philosophy in a day-to-day way. All right, so that's the recap of part one. Let's take a quick breath. Let's recenter our brains a second. Now we're going to talk about part two, tracking down your data. Any data philosophy that you create is only going to be as good as the data you can find and provide to your staff. The key takeaway for this section is if the data access is hard for you, it's probably hard for teachers too. So your first goal may need to be streamlining your system. This is the importance of locating your data. Let's get started. If you're new to an administrator role, there are two things to keep in mind right off the bat, and maybe even if you're a veteran with an administrator role. The first is that many administrators begin their roles without knowing where data is stored. Data may be scattered in many places, in spreadsheets, in programs that have unique logins. It may even be physical copies and filing cabinets just spread throughout the district or across the campus. If you're new to the role, figure out where all of the data that you need lives and how to actually get to it. This includes URLs to data warehouse systems, maybe like Eduphoria, with relevant login credentials. What other resources do you have at your fingertips to dive into various data tables and data visuals? Do you have map data? Is there iReady to look at? Is there TextKia? Is there SAT and PSAT? Is there International Baccalaureate or advanced placement data that you can get into? Those are all just some of the examples, and that doesn't even touch into some of the more logistics, like if you're a school principal, where do I get a hold of the behavior data, the attendance data, etc.? Is your district or school really, really old school and you have data printouts? If so, where are those? Think about as you're finding and tracking down all of your data, writing down things like your secure login credentials, identifying data holders. And data holders are those people that hold the keys to the castle, so to speak. And the castle in this case may be where that data is stored. And observe how teachers collect and manage data that they're using on a day-to-day basis. Then ask yourself, how are your staff or team members collecting data, and are they all doing it the same way? Is it all different? And how do these processes align or not align with your data philosophy? Take notes. As you go through your discovery on where all this data is or what data is available, take notes on friction points in the data access or collection process. Then write them all down as you find it. This includes login credentials, which I know is considered bad digital practice. So apply whatever technology department requirements are necessary by your district to keep things secure. But you need to write it all down somewhere and safely because I guarantee you will forget something. It's inevitable. Also, note how hard it is for you to get into and analyze your information. The ease for you will mirror the difficulty for some, if not all, of your staff. Yes, everyone has different comfort levels with data analysis, so that blanket statement isn't necessarily 100% accurate, but you are the only litmus test that you have access to 100% of the time. So take a note about how difficult it was for you to do a particular thing. If you're going to use this later to help define processes and steps, or even better, improve upon the processes and steps to make it more efficient. Documenting processes now, no matter how efficient or inefficient, will help you and your staff save time later as you begin to streamline things. All right, that was part one in a nutshell. Find your stuff, write it all down. Let's get it let's just figure it out. The next step is classifying and then prioritizing that data. The key takeaway for this segment is to start with your high impact data sources and define what's most important based on your role and your context. If you're new to this or not, you probably have big goals and desires to make positive impacts and changes. The bigger the better in your mind. However, widespread and overambitious initiatives can contribute to the problems that you're trying to solve or to avoid. The next step requires that you get a global or 30,000-foot view of the district or school or department, depending on your leadership position. You have to answer this question: how are we doing and what needs to change? What needs immediate focus and action? There are a ton of data points you can start with or start exploring, but this list here gives you an idea of which ones might give you the biggest bang for your buck, really just out the gate. Gathering all of these data points is applicable to your position and school type, give you an overall understanding of where you are right this second, and if possible, get this data longitudinally across multiple years and see if you can identify trends. If something is trending up or down, that might influence whether you decide if it's critical, important, or not important at all. And those common data sources to prioritize include state level assessments. So that's your STAR, your EOCs, TELPAS, etc. Graduation rates, especially if you're a high school. Of course, only if you're high school. Attendance, but note there teacher and student attendance. Sometimes that data on both can be really telling about where problems or gaps could be occurring and why. Tardiness, SAT, ACT scores, local assessment data by department and subject, demographic data for all of the above, and then teacher evaluations. I'm going to spend a little time talking about teacher evaluations a little later here as well, because I think a lot of us tend to live in the land of student performance and we don't often connect student growth to teacher evaluations. So I want to spend time on that here in just a little bit. Like I mentioned a moment ago, if possible, get this data longitudinally and see if you can identify trends on each of these data types. If something is trending up or down, that might influence what you choose to start emphasizing. For example, you may see that your state has test scores in math that are not where you want them to be. It's tempting to stop there and just say, this is where we're going to focus. Let's start a school-wide initiative. Let's do interdisciplinary lessons that use math wherever possible. Let's start math tutoring. However, your digging may also show that attendance has been dropping year over year, and one of the hardest hit classes is math classes at the start of school and at the end of school. A natural conclusion you might draw is that math scores need some focus, but it's possible that we need simply to just get kids into seats during the school day to help improve math scores. So rather than an intensive doubling down on math time, tutorials, or something like that, you may conclude that it's time to start a communication campaign with parents and students about the importance of being in class. You may need to look at scheduling appointments around the school day instead of during, or even reorganizing the school calendar and events in your district a bit so students aren't necessarily out for things like athletics or electives events at the end of the day, thus missing that last period math class. Other examples could be the teacher attendance in key subject areas is the problem. For example, Algebra 1 scores, we've noticed those are suffering. But I also noticed that I have 3 coaches teaching math that are out of the classroom during 6th and 7th period at the end of the day, at least 40% of the time. How would knowing this information change your emphasis on how you prioritize math? Not that you should prioritize math, but how you prioritize math. The data you observe across multiple points may cause you to draw different conclusions. In this case, the conclusion may be that state test scores in math can't go up as long as kids are not in the building during math class. All right, let's move to the next piece. In the last segment, we nailed down a really specific example about how trends in the data and an overview of the data can really give you an idea of where to start. But that lacks a solid framework and includes all contexts. This can be overwhelming and lead you down rabbit holes that could potentially lead to nowhere. After you have a general idea of where you're at, you need to narrow your field a little bit or apply filters, if you will, to the data you're looking at. So, our key takeaway: your role should define your data focus. Use these questions to define meaningful, actionable goals. So, how do we do that? Depending on your role, there are a lot of different data points you might deem relevant or not so relevant, or maybe kind of relevant. For example, a curriculum coordinator would need different data than a district roster administrator, but they might need similar data that a school principal might need. So first ask, what kind of data is most useful for you? Jot that down somewhere so you can start applying filters to the data you've already collected. Not sure what you need? Ask someone who knows a bit about your role. It's better to ask now than to let huge chunks of time go by and tons of data that could be useful stack up before you can actually get started. So some roles that are highly tied to community involvement and communication are things to consider, which really, if we're being honest, all school roles are tied to community in some way. Very, very few aren't. So think about your perspective and how the community viewpoint could also impact decisions that are being made. Listen to your people. If you're at central office, what are your principals and teachers saying? And if you're a principal, what are your teachers and students saying? The things that they identify are likely the most important things, or at least highly related to the most important things. There are very few things that trouble those groups of people that you work with that are completely unrelated to the priorities that your data show. It might not be obvious what those connections are at first, but I promise you the connections are there if you look. So, what kind of data is being used to guide instruction? What kind of changes might need to happen there? This is where the data philosophy from the last webinar really begins to hit the road and it starts to see traction. What's the biggest need and what are the most achievable of all of those needs? This is a nicer way of saying which is going to give you the most bang for your buck. Remember, you can't change everything all at once. You need to establish short and long term goals and then connect data to both of those types of goals. And remember, quick, small wins can help establish trust with you as a leader, which can lead to ripple effects that make bigger changes easier to swallow and easier to tackle with the right kind of attitude and culture backing it. Remember, data analysis isn't a one size fits all thing. You have to align your focus with your unique responsibilities. Principals, for example, are looking at school level accountability and school level growth, academically and in other areas. They often manage other administrators like assistant principals or instructional coaches. And one of the big tasks for principals, data wise at least, is analyzing and trying to ensure equity across student groups and closing the gaps. Assistant principals are often deep in teacher evaluations and all of the data related to conducting them and analyzing them for decisions. They're also highly tied to discipline, attendance, and some other factors like department budgets. Of course, all of this depends on the structure and the leadership from school to school or district to district, but you get the general idea. Principals and assistant principals often look at different things. And then you even have the scenario where some assistant principals are academically focused while others are only loosely affiliated with academics. This is a perfect example of how data silos can be built, which can hinder actions and appropriate insight. So it feels like I'm kind of saying two different things here. Be aware of data silos, you might want to avoid them, but also your role, you need to look at data that's relevant to you. The idea being is across roles, make sure you're looking at the data that's relevant to you, but also build in opportunities to share what you've learned. Because if you're sharing what you've learned across your roles, you may start to identify trends that are in common and come to conclusions you might not have come to on your own. So, let's talk about an example from a moment ago. Attendance influencing math scores, or discipline records, organizing by teacher, influence instructional time in certain learning settings, or available budget and spending patterns by academic achievement. There are a lot of ways to look at information that might not be natural to you because of data siloing. So be sure to consider all of that when gathering data and analyzing it to make decisions. And then our last example is a curriculum coordinator. They're probably going to be looking at curriculum performance through the lens of district common assessments, benchmarks, state level tests, and even usage data for certain curriculum purchases. They often are in charge of professional development choices and execution at the district level and use the academic data at their fingertips to make those decisions. But how is data siloing a factor for curriculum coordinators as well? Are principals and teachers getting a chance to download their relevant feedback and data to things that a curriculum coordinator isn't often exposed to? How often are professional development decisions made and teachers leave feeling like they didn't find it relevant to their needs at all? The curriculum coordinator picks a focus and points based on the data that's available to them, but probably completely missed the fact that teachers are struggling with students being out of class. So maybe the professional development needs to be about strategies to get students caught up, filling knowledge gaps in quick and efficient ways, and rather than a ground up reapproach to how math is taught. In our next segment, let's talk about the 3 bites of data analysis. We've been talking about large sweeping statements about getting your data, and we've offered suggestions about context, what data might apply to who, and we've made allusions to the fact that trends are important. But what do you actually do for data analysis? That's what this section is about. We're going to break down 3 steps or bites, if you will, to data analysis. They aren't all encompassing, and often the best way to get started is just to look at that data and start asking questions. But here are 3 things to consider as you get started. Your big takeaway for this section: your lived experience as a data user is a lens to where processes can actually improve as you go through this. So, first bite, identifying trends. How do I identify a trend? Look for these things. Are the numbers increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? This shouldn't be confused with positive, negative, or neutral in terms of tone or connotation in the meaning of the data, but can be thought of in terms of positive, negative, or neutral, or no correlations. Sometimes a positive trend is a positive or good thing. Sometimes a negative trend is also a positive or a good thing. So don't get the tone or the connotation of the trend and the description of the trend confused. As an example, a positive trend in math scores is a good thing. but also a negative trend in tardies is a good thing. To paraphrase something I imagine the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland might say, up doesn't always mean up, and up doesn't always mean down, but down and down also don't go hand in hand if down is up and up is down. If you followed that, you're more awesome than me. After that potentially confusing statement, let's talk about a couple of examples. If test scores are rising across multiple years, that's a positive trend with a positive connotation. That's a good thing. Tardies decreasing over time is a negative trend, but a positive connotation. You may also notice that tardies decreasing after breakfast, a particular breakfast program was launched. More on connecting trends and events here in just a second. Another example is teacher evaluation scores appear to have no discernible pattern or connection to student growth. This is an example of no trend having a negative connotation, as teacher evaluation should correlate with student growth. You might also want to ask if there appears to be any kind of triggers that have drastically changed numbers over a short time period. In a timeline sense, is there something that occurred when you see large shifts either up or down in the data? Recall the example from just a couple of seconds ago where tardies decreased after a breakfast program was started. That may warrant further investigation to see if the timing of the event and the change in the data are actually connected to each other. Bite number two. In general, trends identify patterns that can be applied to larger groups, but trends can be swayed by outliers. Outliers can sometimes also point towards root causes of issues or examples to aim for, depending if it's something to target or something to praise. Outliers aren't part of the trend or are in or could be extreme extensions of the trend beyond the normal data set. We'll talk about normal here in just a little bit, so don't worry about that. But when you see things that don't match the trend, this is a sign that there's something that might require further investigation. So, how do you identify those trends? If most of the data tends to increase over time, but there's one set that decreases unexpectedly, that decrease is probably the outlier. Look for single data points that aren't part of the larger group. An example of this could appear in Strive's correlation report, where you look at the patterns between student growth and teacher evaluations. If you see one or two teachers with exceptional evaluations but poor student growth, while at the same time the majority of data tends to be on a line, those teachers are the outliers. It's important to do stratified analysis as well with student populations to identify outliers there. Sometimes trend analysis across all students can hide iniquities with underrepresented student groups. So make sure to peel out in your analysis for each student group to ensure that no individual population tends to outperform or underperform others without getting due attention in your analysis. Let's look at a couple of examples, or talk about a couple of examples. If ninth grade science scores are declining while other contents rise, while all contents are not often analyzed together, if this type of analysis was done, science might be the outlier. Minority groups being minority groups being underserved despite high participation is another example. In a practical sense, this might look like Hispanic students sharply underperforming in the SAT at your school, despite a high proportion of Hispanic students taking the SAT. And we already talked a bit about teacher evaluations being mismatched, so I won't go over that one again. Just for practical visualization, here's a couple of examples of what a positive trend and a negative trend might look like with some outliers included. Remember, a positive trend doesn't necessarily mean positive connotation, and negative doesn't necessarily mean negative connotation. Context is critical when looking at the trends. So in the examples here, you notice that I don't have anything labeled. The X and Y axis aren't labeled. That's on purpose so that this can be applied generically across a lot of concepts. But let's just hypothetically say that the X axis here is pre-test data and the y-axis is post-test data for the same students. I might see that in general, most students in the positive trend graph tend to fall near the trend line. That's expected, that's normal, that's good. But there are 3 students in total that are outliers. There are 2 students towards the top left that might be positive examples of outliers because the students had tremendous growth compared to the trend. But despite that outlier, it's not enough to just recognize it. We have to ask questions. What could I learn from that? How did those kids get up there? How did that occur? How could we translate that and then maybe apply what made those kids excel so quickly to other students? Or is there something else going on that I need to look into? Simultaneously, at the bottom right, we have the one kid that did really well on the pre-test, but very poorly on the post-test. That could be easily explained away with a kid was sick and something didn't go quite right, but it's worth investigating and asking questions about because whatever happened to that kid, maybe there are things we can learn to keep that from happening in other scenarios. Now, the negative trend, if you're data savvy, you may have noticed it's just the mirror image of the positive trend, but you get the general idea. You have outliers on the top right and bottom left. They're really there just to point out, hey, this is interesting. I need to go be asking questions about those outliers and see what I can learn from it and either help eliminate those outliers so they don't skew the trend or try to make things skew towards the outliers because whatever happened there was so beneficial. And this is just an example of an outlier example with no trend. There's no line or cluster that makes sense about what's actually happening in the data. If this was pre-test and post-test data, I would actually conclude that the pre-test scores and the post-test scores aren't related to each other at all, which is a very bad thing. If this was t-test scores on the x-axis and student growth on the y-axis, I might conclude that there is no relationship between the two when there should be. This graph would lead me to a lot of different questions that should guide me to draw conclusions about how to peel out patterns of behavior rather than patterns in the data. So we move from the quantitative data to the qualitative data where I'm beginning to go look into behaviors. Here's bite 3, articulating problem areas. Articulating the problem can be an art and a science combined. Sometimes it takes multiple data points and speaking to a number of people to draw the correct conclusions. We were really alluding to that when we were looking at the outliers from a second ago. Remember, correlation doesn't always mean causation. But what do I mean by that? If you do a little bit of Googling, you can actually see that there are some really interesting examples on correlation not being causation. So, for example, over the last 15 years, the name Margarita and the number of motor vehicle thefts in Indiana have a very strong correlation between them. They're completely unrelated. Similarly, over the past 15 years, there's a correlation between the number of associate's degrees that have been awarded in science technologies and the number of Google searches for avocado toast. Completely unrelated. Well, okay, maybe those two might be related, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions there. So pair that thought with the fact that you are limited on time and your intuition may be right when you see a trend. You can actually dig too deep and keep digging past a logical conclusion and if you really let yourself. But with enough experience and insight, you can draw some very powerful conclusions relatively quickly. Remember, trends are broad focuses, outliers are targeted interventions, and both of these things matter. Let me show you an example of how some of these data things kind of marinated and came to solid conclusions in a real world example. Here we have two different schools, both looking at the same data in the same time frame. We're focusing in on t-test domain 1 planning and the 4 sets of expectations in domain 1. You'll notice when looking at the breakdown that the top school or the top graph, you see a pretty what I would call normal bell curve where you have a whole lot of teachers in proficient and petering off in fewer numbers down to either side on the left and the right. This is likely an expected kind of trend. Same district, different school. On the bottom half, you'll see there's a definite skew where more teachers are performing on a far higher level. And so this really starts to beg the question, are the teachers at one school really that much more effective than they are at the other school? It's entirely possible that the answer is yes, but it's worth asking the question to start digging and actually looking into patterns. This may mean also that we need to do some inter-rater reliability with our evaluators across the district and make sure that everyone understands what proficient, accomplished, distinguished, developing, etc. actually look like. That inter-rater reliability can be really critical in doing things for like the teacher incentive allotment. Because if you were to submit data that looked kind of like this, it might beg the question, are patterns actually coming out that are meaningful? A way to cross-check this and see if there's something that might need to be digging into is using Strive's correlation tool to see how strong is the correlation or is there even a correlation between student growth and t-test scores. With this particular example, we can see that the correlation coefficient is a 0.22. That means the correlation is not exceptionally strong. But we can kind of see that they're clustered in a line-ish from the bottom left to the top right. And so this really just tells me that if the previous graphs are the same data as this graph, just represented in a different way with new data paired with it, there might be something I need to tease out a little bit more because it's not obvious what some of the problems are. But I have some lessons learned a minute ago about outliers. I need to start asking questions. This teacher on the top left right here that has a 0% on student growth but a 4.5 average t-test score. That is really unusual. What the heck is going on there? Well, with this practical example, we actually found that the teacher forgot to submit their student growth scores. Their t-test score, when they actually received the student growth score, came a little further over onto this side and improved the correlation coefficient. So sometimes just finding outliers can improve your data because something was missed. Towards the bottom right, we see another cluster of teachers that are outliers where their student growth is out of this world, but their t-test scores are really, really terrible. That might beg some questions for me to go in and really look at those t-test evaluations to start looking at evidence. Is what's happening in those classrooms really that bad? What are the classes? Are these classes filled with gifted and talented students that are highly motivated to learn themselves, and therefore they have student growth no matter who's in the classroom? Or is there something hinky about the student growth data? Maybe the t-test scores are more reflective of what's actually happening, and maybe the kids were prepared for the test that was measuring student growth. Those are things that are worth asking when you see those outliers so that you can really bring them back into the trend and improve your correlation coefficient so you make and draw better conclusions. And I might also notice on this particular chart, there's a big cluster of people on this far right side that got a 100% on the student growth. So many, in fact, that I can't even tell how many dots are actually even there without significantly zooming in. That might cause me to ask a completely different set of questions related to how are students being prepared for their student growth exams. So practical example with what we were kind of talking about up to now. All right, we're nearing the finish line. Let's talk about how to understand normal. For this segment, let's be careful moving into it because we can talk about normal in terms of performance, and then we can also talk about norms in terms of practices and meeting expectations. Two different things with very similar terms. Your key takeaway here is norms are things that can help prevent misinterpretation of normal. And remember, growth may be just returning to the baseline depending on your context. So, I've mentioned this in parts over the last several slides, especially when talking about trends. Looking at data over time helps you understand and establish not only trends, but what is typical performance for whatever data set you're analyzing. If it's assessment performance, teacher evaluation, student attendance, anything, look at each set of data across a few years worth of time. This will help you determine what is typical or what baseline is. It might or might not be where you want it to be, but it gives you an idea of what is usual or what to expect if nothing changes. Now, we're going to talk in parts 3 and 4 of this webinar series about how to use things like multi-test analysis and single test analysis to do this kind of longitudinal analysis on your assessment data. So be sure to come back for that. But until then, think about how you can pull this set of data to put things side by side, 3 or so years at a time worth of information so you can identify what baseline or normal actually is. And as usual, be sure to disaggregate all of that data by student demographics so that you can verify that none of your student populations are unintended outliers from the normal, or maybe even have totally different normal than what the average student performance is. This kind of normal finding across data sets is most helpful when you have common assessments across schools, contents, and grade levels. So kind of talking about tips and practices that you need to make sure you're executing. Common formative assessments help ensure that as many variables as possible are removed when looking at differences in performances between schools, teachers, and student groups. It's practically impossible to judge performance over time and compare across groups if each group is taking different assessments with potentially different rigor, different content, and different question formatting. Then there's creating visuals. It's a must when doing this kind of analysis. If you don't have Aware Premium, you'll have to dive into spreadsheets a little bit to build those data visuals. And again, when we get into parts 3 and 4, I'm going to show you how to do some of this data visual building. So again, make sure you come back for that. But in general, multi-test analysis and single test analysis are actually pretty user friendly. So take a risk and dive into those on your own between now and then if you haven't already. And then we can really dive into some of the nitty gritty on how to use them in really powerful ways in the next parts of our series. After doing a longitudinal analysis across years, consider doing the same kind of analysis within the same school year across units. So, for example, if you're looking at eighth grade math, put the unit tests of unit 1, 2, 3, and 4 all together side by side and look at performance trends across the school year. As each additional test comes up, you can add that to your analysis and use those ongoing trends to have really targeted conversations about how performance is working in PLCs. Most analysis is only going to be as good as the students that are actually in your building. And I want to pause for a second and be clear with that statement. I'm not saying that good students make for good data. I'm saying your data is only important if the students are actually still in your building. For the most part, you don't need to go further back than 3 years with most analysis. Going back further than that, you begin to introduce additional variables that are difficult to remove from the analysis, such as student physical and mental development. Students change pretty massively over the course of many years, and if you've ever taught middle school, you know that something magical happens between that seventh grade and eighth grade year over that summer for most students. They change so dramatically. If you go beyond 3 years, those changes in how students think, learn, and behave really become factors and invalidate some of the comparisons that you're trying to do over more than 3 years. So, as such, those things, you don't need to add those as factors in your analysis. There is an exception to that rule, however. If you have teachers that have been teaching the same thing for more than 3 years, it can sometimes be helpful to run extended longitudinal analysis on individual teachers across years rather than students across years. While the students are different from year to year, you can get a general idea of how a teacher evolves over time doing a more extended analysis that is more than 5 years. There's always exceptions to the rules. Now let's talk about procedural norms. This is our final segment in the talking about norms and how to establish them as procedures can improve your analysis. Your key takeaway for this segment: data access and analysis must be supported by people systems, not just data systems. Your data analysis and the impact of the conclusions and decisions made from it are only going to be as good as the norms that are put in place for continuing practices that will continue to drive the desired change that you're pushing for. Take advantage of or implement some sort of mentoring or cohort program in which new staff members are paired with veteran staff members who can provide information on their new position. This is the number one reason that norms fall apart with data practices, because turnover in teaching is higher than it has ever been in the past. So well-established practices begin to erode very quickly without ways to reinforce it. This can also be really helpful with teaching new staff members on how to conduct data analysis with the expectations that are established for your school. Don't just let the mentoring be about surviving the school year. Add flavor to it that helps the new staff members teach each other about best practices, data analysis, and your established norms. Establish standards for regular meeting cadences in which mentors and mentees can meet, discuss problems, answer questions, and hash out documentation needs that could help your school determine process norms. Ask groups of teachers to document gaps in communication, resource allocation, and knowledge that could be solved through program initiatives such as professional development or data warehouse implementation. And be flexible. Not all teachers need the same things. Make sure you identify the needs of the teachers and put them into sessions that will help them get the things that they need. Bring teacher groups together to discuss procedural needs that could be solved through collaboration or common software uses. For example, it can be inefficient unless it's required for each content department to use software that's unique to their roles but inaccessible to others. Similarly, across more traditional departments, that same barrier can hinder cross communication and insight sharing. It's worth noting the school's culture can also meaningfully impact information sharing and data gathering. If the culture needs to be cultivated and nurtured, then information may be much harder to come by. And that brings my portion to a conclusion. I'm going to do a quick summary. Let's talk about tracking your data as a summary. First, you have to locate it. Get that 30,000-foot view. You have to really start to understand the trends across gaps in time. You have to use guiding questions to try to help you understand what you're seeing and what's going on. And you need to consider individual roles as potential filters that need to be applied to that data, while also being cautious of data silos, because sometimes you can leap to conclusions that are incomplete or inefficient for what's actually happening. Then we talked about the 3 bites of data analysis. You need to prioritize that data. What's important, what's less important, what's not important at all. You identify those trends for application. You look for identifiers or outliers, rather. The outliers are things that point towards things that are interesting. You articulate the problem or the celebrations. I didn't talk about that much back there, but it's worth calling out now. Sometimes you need to articulate what's going really well and celebrate that with your staff. And then you need to start sharing and drawing conclusions. And then finally, we talked about normal and norms. You have to understand what normal or typical performance actually looks like in your context. You need to establish, share, and practice norms for data, practices, and behaviors. And remember, culture is absolutely critical. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Armando.